Hello, a very warm good morning to all of you, and welcome to Unacademy. Welcome to today's The Hindu newspaper analysis, where we take a look at today's international edition of the Hindu newspaper, analyze the articles, and go beyond the articles for the relevance in the prelims as well as the mains examination. Today, we are going to cover a host of around nine different topics for various different relevance. So, first of all, the uneasy truce in Beijing following the Xi Jinping and Trump, the summit talks between China and US. So, there we are going to talk about the Trump factor, the Taiwan factor, and the trade which dominated these talks. Then, medical education in India needs to pivot to quality over quantity. Now, in the row and in the entire aspect following the neat paper disaster and the leakage, here it is a time to reflect upon the medical education in India and whether we need to focus only on the quantity or also on the quality of doctors that we are producing. So, this becomes relevant for your GS paper 2. This becomes relevant for your GS paper 3. The Iran war, India's strategic autonomy challenges, that is, India's strategic independence, that is being challenged left, right, and center owing to the push and the pulls by the US. Building a preventive health culture in India. Now, in this, we will take a look into the government schemes also, even though it is not mentioned in the article per se, but we shall expand that and understand the governmental outlook for the preventive health care. Bursting at the seams, this is about the inflation and the limited headroom that RBI has in order to control the inflation and how, in the long run, it can impact the money supply, which can also impact overall the growth potential. Relevant for your GS paper 3. Cooling doctrine with increased instances of heat waves in India, it is time to come up with a kind of a cooling doctrine. And that is where, again, the article restricts itself to only the aspect that we need to find creative solutions. Here we shall also be discussing about what is passive cooling and what do we understand by the India Cooling Action Plan. So this again becomes relevant, GS paper 3. Capital flight and the pressure on rupee. The rupee, the value has been sinking. Per se, it is not that bad, but when compared to international currencies, it is something of a point of concern, and the capital flight will have much greater impact in the coming days. So, why does that capital flight happen? That is something which has been explored in this article, relevant for your GS paper 3. Now, in page 3, you have one small snippet talking about that Munnar has decided to levy additional charges on the tourist vehicles. But while that in itself does not make much of a news headline, we will take this opportunity to discuss the changes which have been brought about in the Solid Waste Management Rules 2026. So that again becomes relevant for your prelims, and WPI more than doubles to 8.3% in April, which is going to lead to further pressures on the growth parameters as well. So that is all that we are going to cover, and we are going to explore the depths in each of these, starting with the first topic and the first article appearing in the page 1, that is uneasy truce in Beijing as Trump and Xi discuss trade Taiwan. So here you have three T's which are important. First is Trump, then you have trade, and then it is Taiwan. One can argue that the first T is dominating everything else, and that is Mr. Trump himself. Now, it is after a long time that US and China are having a summit level talks in Beijing. Now, while these summit level talks are being held simultaneously, one cannot but notice the kind of equal position that China is seeking to hold itself to US. US no longer has the power or the impact of a global hegemon that it has enjoyed ever since the Second World War. For the first time, obviously, you had for a brief period the Soviet also, which challenged the US, but never on the same terms. This is the case where China's economic growth, the economic rise, and the military growth has been directly targeting the US. And for the first time here, in fact, Xi Jinping, in his opening address, did mention that US and China can work as partners provided that US does not interfere in Taiwan. Now, this has set a kind of a clear-cut condition that US has to fulfill this, and also has served a warning to the US that if US gets uh, uh, basically involved in Taiwan and the independence of the region of Taiwan, then China will take it as a direct threat. And China has issued a veiled warning that it can lead to military conflict, which can impact the global order. Now, both the leaders, they have argued that look, this is the most important bilateral relationship presently across the world, and which is true to the larger amount of the material substance as well. But at the same time, one cannot fail but notice that here China is appearing to have a superior hand. Why? Because in the case of the ongoing conflict in Iran, China is the only country which has the power in order to solve that issue. US cannot reach a ceasefire agreement without the agreement of China, because one has to understand that even though the ceasefire or the mediations are happening through Pakistan, but China is directly involved. Because when we talk about, let's suppose, the Iran conflict, that is the one which is dominating the global spheres as of now. Now, this Iran conflict, one has to understand the dependency of Iran on China. Iran and China are following a kind of a closed economy. And what do we mean by that? We have to understand this in a nuanced manner. They are following a kind of a closed economic system and a closed economic model. For example, when we talk about the oil exports from Iran, majority of it is parked in China. And in order to escape the global sanctions, the crippling global sanctions that Iran has been facing for some amount of time, so Iran is sending to China oil at discounted price, obviously. And China is paying Iran in yuan, not in dollar, in order to escape the global sanctions. Now, in this particular scenario, where will Iran use that yuan? Iran cannot go to the European market and buy products by giving out yuan. So that means that all the consumable items, the machineries, and every equipment that Iran requires, from the defense equipments to the capital machineries to agricultural aspect, everything is being taken from China. So that is what makes Iran completely dependent on China and gives China a kind of an extreme stronghold in the future decision making of Iran. In fact, during the entire conflict, it has been argued that had it not been for the consistent surveillance activities being provided and the facilities of the satellites being provided by China, Iran would have been in a much worse state. So US does realize this, and that is why to resolve the Iran conflict, China's role has become ever so important. Now, that is where China has increased its role as compared to the previous summit meetings between US and China. Now, other than this, when we talk about Taiwan, now there for a long period of time, US has maintained a kind of an unambiguous position that it believes in the sovereignty aspect of Taiwan. It does believe in the freedom of navigation in the region of the Taiwan Strait and so on. However, yesterday, when you had Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, making a statement, at that point of time, Taiwan and the issue of Taiwan was not mentioned even once. Later on, the White House spokesperson did say that the US stance for Taiwan remains unchanged. But one has to understand and one has to look into this with a greater detail. US over the past few months had allocated $11 billion for the defense equipments and the defense requirements of Taiwan, but not a single penny of that has been allocated by Mr. Trump. So that means US is taking a kind of a back seat in terms of the interference in Taiwan, and this is something which is not unexpected. When you take a look at the national security doctrine issued by US a few months ago, there US virtually ceded the space of that entire region to China, that let me take care of the Western Hemisphere, you take care of the Eastern Hemisphere, more or less somewhere in that crude terms. So that means for the first time, China has an ascendancy. Now, the important aspect of trade. Now, when we talk about trade here, So trade is a very vital sticking point between these two nations. And China is not like India, where we don't have a bargaining chip. So when US did threaten China with a kind of a crippling sanction and tariff, what did China do? China basically issued a counter threat that we will not export any of the critical minerals, the rare earth elements, and the materials made out of them. And that would have rendered the industrial output of US to a screeching halt. So that is why US could not impose it. So China has got leverages. And Mr. Trump, if he is good at something, he is good at understanding leverages. So here, when it comes to trade, China wants the import and the access to semiconductors, the high-end tech, right? So high-end tech, for example, the GPUs, that is something that China desperately needs from US. While it is developing its own, but nonetheless, China needs this from US. Whereas what does US want? US basically doesn't want anything so much from China. US wants something that China doesn't provide to anyone else, and that is market access. Market access, particularly in the case of agricultural goods. Because and this has become very sensitive area for US under Mr. Trump, because one of his major electorate is the corn belt in the region of the Great Plains, and that is where the farmers are reeling under crisis, mind you, under the previous threat issued few months ago by Mr. Trump. At that point of time, that is in 2025, China took a decision not to import soy meal anymore from US, and it diversified its source to Argentina. That meant the farmers in US are getting impacted. And mind you, this is the year 2026 when US goes into midterm elections, and that can be a deciding factor for Mr. Trump's entire policy making in the coming years. So that is why this is a vitally sensitive area for the entire MAGA or the Trump support base. And that is where this is the sticking point for US. So trade, these talks are happening, but here not much of a give of a room is available. It is the case with the Iran conflict and Taiwan, where some substance can be recovered out of it. Now, for your prelims examination, important to know that this is your region of Taiwan Strait between China and Taiwan, and also important to know that immediately below Taiwan, you have the Luzon Strait. So Luzon Strait separates Taiwan from the region of Philippines. The entire region is disputed. China claims it as its own as per the 9 dash line. Now, that is the case of the Trump and the Xi Jinping summit level talks. Now, before coming into the next article, an announcement for all of you. Now we have come up with the platinum batch, a new batch of economy for civil services examination 2027 has started. Do become a part of this. Ask your mentors what is this platinum batch, and do experience a new kind of education and informative learning, whereby you get to interact with the educators, the faculties live, and you get the doubt resolved live, face to face, with the cameras on. Attention is given, discipline is maintained, success can be ensured. Now, here, then we come to the second article, that is medical education in India needs to pivot to quality over quantity. Now, it is basically in the midst of the cancellation of the NEET UG examination that the entire medical system, the medical education in India, needs to have a closer look. Now, the cancellation of the NEET examination, obviously, it has been announced just now, a few minutes ago, that it is supposed to be held on 21st of June now. The new date has been fixed. But here, if we take a look at the larger medical sector of India, we have to address some of the lacunae there. Over the past decade, we have made immense strides in terms of the quantity of doctors that we are generating. Right. Now we need to focus on the aspect of quality as well. So overall, the number of seats that you observe be it in the undergrad, MBBS, the postgrad, everywhere, the number of seats have increased. So that means the students have greater opportunities to become doctor or to chase their dreams. So here, medical colleges have increased from about 596 in 21-22 to over 818. Massive rise. MBBS seats rose from around 83,000 to nearly 1.29 lakh, while post graduation seats has reached a record number of 85,000. One can argue that even this is not sufficient for a large population like India. This needs to be accelerated and continued in this momentum at least for a decade in order to have any tangible result on the ground. But having said that, is just the mere increase in the number of seats sufficient? Or is it time to focus on quality? There have been increased instances of people not being satisfied with the doctors that they come across. While the doctor to patient ratio has been improving, but the quality of doctors is not, in a way, something which is beyond doubt. Now, the article argues that number of people choosing medical profession in itself, that number has been declining because the profession which at one point of time used to be glorious and the white apron and the white cloth along with the stethoscope would be seen as a novelty factor today is being seen as a burdensome profession with a challenging work life balance. Anyone who chooses this medical career, medical profession, has to align with the fact that there is at least a decade of study, specialization, super specialization which needs to be done before you actually enter into the services or you actually start earning. And that is something that not everybody is ready to put in. At the same time, one has to notice and one has to understand that even the quality of the colleges that we have, the number of seats, when we say the number of seats have increased, the number of colleges that have increased, not all of them have the same infrastructural support or the faculty support. So that is impacting the type of doctors and the quality of doctors also. Across many of the areas, large number of medical seats still go vacant and are not filled. Those are the seats which the candidates they don't deem that to be very lucrative because there are multiple specialities, subspecialties, super specialties, etc. So some of them have a lower demand. So while the seats are being increased, many of them are lying vacant. So that means there is a larger gap. Now, that is what the article has argued about. Now, what is the issue with the quality? One of the major issue is the issue with the quality faculty. The quality faculty is less in number. Now, that you can attribute and that you can basically say for any and every kind of field in our country, be it the STEM courses, that is the science, tech, engineering, mathematics, in those courses, research courses, medical courses, everywhere. The serious faculty or the kind of quality faculty that you need, that is in short number. And that is especially severe in preclinical and paraclinical and non-clinical disciplines as well. What is the difference between preclinical and paraclinical, by the way? Preclinical deals with the how of the body. So it will deal with basically the aspects like uh, anatomy, right? Physiology, biochemistry, and so on. Whereas paraclinical will deal with micro genome activities or micro drugs, etc. So, what and why, the absolute detailing of it. So, that is the basic difference between preclinical and paraclinical, just to understand that. Now, why is there a quality or the shortage of faculty? One of the reason is that historically there has been a low interest in this area. Then when you become a faculty, when do you become a faculty? When you have done your post graduation, when you have got that degree. Now historically the number of seats in post graduation were less. Suddenly if you have increased the undergrad seats, does not mean you have more qualified faculties also available. So it will take some time for those faculties to be post graduates, have that specialty, have that experience, and then come to the teaching line. Then Rapid expansion for colleges have suddenly increased the demand of the faculty, but the supply is still not met. So that is why there is a shortage of faculty. But this is not the only issue that the colleges are dealing with. There are other issues as well. For example, there is still a kind of an outdated curriculum where you have a checklist based academics which are being followed, that you have to finish these many credits, these many courses, and so on. Practical exposure is very, very limited depending upon the college that you are enrolled in. The practical exposure can be very limited. Then focus on rote learning since the undergrad days. In fact, that is one of the major issues with our education systems in our since our school days. We are focused on rote learning. We are told that this is the question, this is the answer, ratify this answer, vomit it in the examination, and you will get the marks. In fact, that is what has reduced the analytical ability and the critical reasoning ability of majority of the human resource capital that India has. So that is where it translates into the medical institutes and the medical area as well. There is a lack of relevant research in medical research or in medical sector. Any progress cannot be done without research. Research and development is the only constant in medicine. For example, newer medicines, newer drugs, newer drug trials, newer prescriptions or prescriptive ways, everything needs research. In our country, the research is not very much aligned with the day to day realities and requirements of the country. The research is more or less a kind of an academic task. For example, if I need to be promoted, for example, I need to file a research paper, right? And that research paper, if I file it, only then I will get promoted. So I will do any kind of randomized research. Maybe I will plagiarize something here or there and I will publish a research paper, not to be relevant in solving any of the problems that the country faces. So that is why there is a lack of relevant research. Relevant is the important keyword here. Now, the world is changing in front of our eyes. AI, machine learning, analysis, that is something which is being solved in the manner or the span of seconds. And here, basically, that is where we are lacking. A new undergrad, for example, has got so many tools at his or her disposal. They are not being taught how to use those tools. That is going to be the frontier of medical research and medical treatment 10 years down the line, or even 5 years down the line. AI has to be an enabler, an enhancer, not a replacement of the quality doctors. So that enhancement tool needs to be taught right from the undergrad days. Now, creation. So, how can you solve, for example, the issue of shortage of faculty? Issue of shortage of faculty. How can this be solved? So, basically, this can be solved through multiple ways. National faculty pool involving including public and private sectors, where it becomes more lucrative for the people in the profession to enter the faculty role. Then inclusion of experienced clinicians and academicians. This is happening to some extent already in structured teaching. Provide them with a kind of credit also, and also this gives a real practical exposure to the students. Use of digital platforms and centralized teaching modules in order to teach larger number of population at the same time. So this can be the immediate solution to deal with the shortage of faculty, but the long term, you have to increase the number of postgraduate seats. Now, what is the way forward? Now, we have, as a country, slightly solved the quantity issue, even though it is not completely solved. Slightly. We are at least in the right path when it comes to quantity of doctors that we are generating. The quality needs to be solved, right? So here, the next phase has to prioritize on competency, clinical reasoning, ethical training, practical exposure, and research orientation. And how do you do that? You do that basically by ensuring curriculum reform, more practical exposure rather than the checklist academic based, high quality teaching and adequate faculty, early integration of research since the undergrad days, not after the postgrad or during postgrad. Since the undergrad days, the candidates have to be taught how to carry out and why to carry out and which area to carry out research in. Role of AI and digital tech, that is the digital health, AI literacy, modern diagnostic tools, all of them. Need for modern infrastructure in the colleges, in the institutes, modern equipment, digital systems, and better training environment. So these are basic requirements which need to be fulfilled. Then the question associated with this. Basically, India's healthcare requirements can be fulfilled by ensuring a balance between both quality and quantity. Let's suppose this is a 10 marker question. So, how do you write the answer for this? So, in the introduction, you talk about the requirement of a growing population. A population of 1.4 billion requires or needs to maintain a healthy the doctor to patient ratio. As per the WHO standards, the doctor to patient ratio should be 1 is to 1000. However, or 800 roughly, 1 is to 800, or in most worst cases, 1 is to 1000. Now, in India, in many of the regions, you have the ratio at 1 is to 52,000. So there, the quantity issue also needs to be solved. But at the same time, the quality issue has to be resolved as well. So in the intro, you talk about the requirement of better healthcare. And then in the body, you talk about the role for quantity first, briefly. Okay. And then quality. How do you measure or how do you maintain a quality standard? What do you do for that? So that is something where we have discussed about the various ways and measures of faculty, AI, research, curriculum, all of that you can include. Okay. Now the next topic and the next article in the editorial, the Iran war, India's strategic autonomy challenges. Now, this article basically talks about the fact that when it comes to India, India's foreign policy has largely been that often of indicative of strategic independence, strategically autonomous. Okay, if you can include statistical data in the answer, it is very, very much desirable. It adds authenticity to your answer. Now, Iran war basically has tested India's independent strategic position. India used to be always a follower of non alignment. And that basically has been replaced, the term has been replaced by multi alignment. We are a believer in multipolar world, that there can be multiple sources of power across the world. Right. Now, that is the kind of strategic autonomy that India has enjoyed. However, with the kind of Trumpian politics which has been followed, now this resolve has been put to test. Iran war has further pushed India slightly to the brink, and Iran is important for India when it comes to strategic resources, oil, fertilizer in certain cases, everything is impacted by the Iran war. And US to some extent has been holding India at ransom because of this. Now, for a long period of time since the era of, it can be argued, Bill Clinton, you have the case where the US presidents were always seeking to increase the ties with India in order to counterbalance China, right? Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, then followed by Barack Obama, then Trump in his first presidency, then Biden. All of them have tried to improve the overall trade relationship, strategic relationship with India. Now, as a result of that, US became India's largest trading partner, replacing China in around 2021, 2022. US started becoming India's largest trading partner, the bilateral trading partner. However, Trump 2.0 has disrupted the entire global order, and India is no exception. Now, while this global order has been disrupted, India is seeking newer friends, as is the rest of the world. And that is where you have various different overtures made by India. For example, you have the outreach to France, to European Union. The long pending free trade agreements are being signed left, right, and center. So India is trying to hedge its bets. And so is the case with European nations as well. France and India have almost agreed to the case of the fighter planes, Rafale jets, in large numbers, even though there is a dispute associated with the sharing of the source code, which France is not keen on sharing with India, obviously, and India wants that source code. So the negotiations are getting dragged, but the expectation is that in the next couple of years, there might be the signature which will be put on the deal. But as this is happening, overall, we need to ensure that this or any kind of overtures that India makes, that is in balance with our long-term national interest. So that is what the entire article is about. So impact of Iran war on the energy security. We have experienced the inflation, the rising inflation across the world. For example, yesterday, the news stories were there that Cuba has ran into a kind of a chaos and the blackouts on the streets because it has run out of fuel. Right. Today, when the Prime Minister is on the visit to UAE, there are issues on the agenda to be discussed about energy security and even the proposal to have an underwater pipeline supplying oil directly to India. So, the countries across the world are trying to manage this energy scarcity. Regional stability is at risk, strategic autonomy, we have talked about, and India's diplomatic balancing has been put to test. Now, Iran is important for India for oil imports, connectivity to Central Asia through Chabahar port. And this is where India has been investing continuously for the past decade. Now, even that is at risk. This was, in fact, the first budget which was presented this year where no money was allocated to the Chabahar port, which was an exception for the past decade. Access to Central Asia and Afghanistan is put at risk, and that takes away a substantial market chunk away from India into the laps of China. And regional geopolitical balance, that is where Pakistan, China, everything, that basically comes a risk for India. Now, India's geopolitical storm, if you observe, so strategic autonomy is becoming more and more difficult for India. For example, US, if you take a look at US has been threatening sanctions on India and tariffs on India and has been asking reduce oil imports from Russia. In fact, the kind of a 30-day reprieve that US provided to Russia, that you can import Russian oil, but only under these conditions. It is again that of a global hegemon, something that India has to accept owing to the trade balance that India has. Right. Now, distance itself, US has asked India to distance itself from Iran. But this has been going on, one can argue, since 2009 itself, when Hillary Clinton visited India and did make that appeal to the Indian government. Now, US has basically taken a very stern stance on even the conversation about de-dollarization. Now, you had the BRICS ministerial meet where this was not at all discussed for after a long period of time. And here limit BRICS based initiatives. So, all of that has been the kind of US demands that India has been forced to fulfill. So, India doesn't find itself in a very good position as of now. That is where same is the case with the European Union. European Union, which has for a long period of time considered itself as a staunch US ally, has been left in the lurch. And that is why European Union is also seeking newer trade partners, newer growing powers to align with. And that is where India comes in. So when we talk about the European Union, that is where India and France is one of the leading examples of the defense deals when it comes to defense, when it comes to energy in terms of renewables, right? When it comes to technology sharing, that is where, and even in defense, India and Germany, they are very close to signing a deal regarding the submarines, right? So India is looking away from Russia, looking away from US into the region of European Union. But the article argues that only these defense ties are not sufficient. One needs to go for broader relationship. Otherwise, India stands to be ignored. But while all this is something that you might already know, one of the factors that you have to understand and we as a country have to realize, Why is it that the world is is almost bowing down to China, and why is it that China has got such a great hold over what goes on across the world? Is it because of Xi Jinping? Is it because of the people of China? Is it because of the population of China? No. It is because of the growth of China in critical areas. China is arguably one of the superpowers, the rising superpowers, which has a peer-to-peer status with US now. When it comes to critical tech, when it comes to very advanced tech, it can be argued that China is leading US in these tech areas. One of the reasons why we will later take a look into the capital flight from India. One of the reasons why there has been a lot of flight of capital away from India is the growth of China. AI led growth in China has put in a lot of money into that. And that has fueled a lot of startups and a lot of innovative industries. We need to do that. Even though we are not an export based economy like China, we are a consumption based economy. But we need to improve our economic standing. We need to grow, and we need to grow fast. And that is where we need to carry out reforms when it comes to providing employment. We need to carry out reforms when it comes to cutting edge technology, research. And that is where maybe 20 years down the line, we can look at dominating the critical technological requirements. Till that point of time, we are just a mere passenger, like the rest of the world, in the topsy turvy ride that the global hegemons offer to us. So, nonetheless, we have to carefully navigate great power rivalry while protecting energy security, economic interests, like what Machiavelli suggested many years ago. So that is why one has to understand that if India wants to remain strategically independent, it has to be economically independent. For that, it needs to be independent in terms of energy, independent in terms of defense, independent in terms of tech. Now, that is what the gist of the article is about. Now, here, coming to the next article, building a preventive health culture in India. Now, this is the article which talks about the case that in India, the culture of healthcare is very different. We take a look at healthcare as thinking what can treat us or get rid of diseases for us. That is healthcare for us. The article argues that this is why we have large number of population who are suffering from chronic illnesses, diseases, hypertension, cardiovascular diseases. They are becoming a norm. Obesity, that is becoming a norm. Now we are suffering from that because we do not follow preventive healthcare, well-being. Wellness is not something which is in our culture. For example, take a look at your own extended family. In your own extended family, how many of the people do you know who go for regular full body scans and full body checkup? It would be minuscule. Now, what that leads to is that many of the diseases, which if caught in a very nascent stage, could be cured, they remain hidden and latent in the body for a long period of time till it becomes too late, and then you tend to lose. So that is what the article is arguing, that we need to change from the case of cure to the case of prevention. After all, the old adage always goes prevention is better than cure, isn't it? So, same is the argument here. Now, it also argues that look, when you are when is it that maximum population suffers from various issues in the age group of 30 to 40, in their 30s and the 40s? That is when the body's metabolism changes, the various different mechanisms within the body changes, and we are unable to adapt or keep pace with the change. Why? Because we have the case of chasing the careers, chasing the family burdens, responsibilities, and so on. As a consequence of that, one gets left behind in the case of healthcare. Now, human body is tremendously gifted. If even at a later stage, if you just take care of your diet, if you just take care of your routine, if you just be disciplined enough, human body has got the tendency to recover and get well very soon. So that is what the article is arguing. But we will also take an opportunity here to take a look at the government schemes targeting wellness rather than cure. So, first of all, India has traditionally viewed health as something to recover after illness rather than something which has to be maintained on a daily basis. True healthcare should involve continuous self care, healthy lifestyle, and prevention of diseases before it even develops. Approximately 270 million Indians are living in the condition of chronic diseases. Right, many of the people are not even aware about the diseases that they suffer from. Right, so this reflects lack of awareness, poor screening culture, delayed diagnosis, and insufficient routine health monitoring. The age group between 30 to 40, that is where you have the metabolic disorders, cardiovascular risks, and lifestyle related diseases that starts to develop silently. Individuals are focused on careers and family responsibility, and that is why this happens. So that needs to change. And what are the government interventions? One of the major government interventions under the Ayushman Bharat, that is the Ayushman Arogya Mandirs, the health and the wellness centers. Now, under that, screening for hypertension, diabetes, oral cancer, breast cancer, and cervical cancer is done. Maternal and child health care for finding out anemic cases to solve that. That is their immunization, the mental health care services, geriatric care, yoga and wellness activities, lifestyle counseling, all of that is a part of that. But other than that, you also have National Program for Prevention and Control of Non-Communicable Diseases. Here, screening of individuals in the age group above 30 years for detection of diabetes, hypertension, cardiovascular diseases, stroke, common cancers, and also promoting the case of behavioral change. Other than that, you have the case of the UIP, that is where you provide vaccination, universal immunization program under the earlier named Mission Indradhanush, Poshan Abhiyan, National Health Mission, School Health and Wellness Program, again implemented under the Ayushman Bharat, and Fit India movement and Eat Right India. So these are the schemes and the programs that the government is running in order to treat and ensure wellness so that you don't need to get yourself cured. You can be well enough. So that is the case of these government initiatives that you need to recall or retain for your examination. Now, another article in the editorial section that is bursting at the seams. Now, basically, today, or in fact, yesterday, when the WPI numbers were released, India did expect, or we'd all observe, that the WPI numbers, the wholesale price index, now that has almost skyrocketed, right? And this is largely owing to the case of the fuel price increase. And mind you, this is a global crisis that we are talking about. As we speak, Indonesia has more than doubled the fuel prices. Cuba is running into chaos. Western neighbor, even though Pakistan can no longer be a litmus test for comparison, but still, they have almost tripled the price of fuel. Today morning, you would have received notifications that the price of fuel in our country has also increased by 3 to 4 rupees in various different metro cities. So the price of fuel has increased, and that has fueled inflation. But having said that, still, the amount of inflation is not truly reflective of the amount of price shock in the fuel sector, which means many of the producers are still absorbing a lot of the price pressure. That means more inflation is to follow. The currency is falling, depreciating. Now, currency, Indian rupee, which on an average would be depreciating at 2 to 3% annually, 2 to 3% annually. That would be the depreciation of rupee annually against the US dollar. In the past 2.5 months, it has depreciated by 8.5%. Right? So the depreciation is high. Now, if a country is export dependent, like China, depreciation of currency is good, but we are a consumption based economy. Right? So, in that particular case, depreciation means your imports become costlier. And that basically can bring in huge amount of inflation. Right? Now, when the inflation happens, now what do you do as a central bank when inflation happens? You will tighten the money supply. That you have to do, right? Tighten money supply. M3 basically. In money supply, you have M1, M2, M3, M4. So M3 is to be tightened. Now, when you tighten money supply, inflation can be controlled, but at the same time, the growth will reduce. Now, if the growth reduces in these times, that means number of jobs generated can be further less. If the number of jobs generated are less, what does that mean? There will be a dangerous aspect of lack of demand in the economy. When there is a lack of demand in a consumption based economy like India, that means your overall production and your GDP numbers will start tumbling down the stairs. So, this is the eventual chain reaction that we are staring at, that we have to understand. And that is owing to the kind of various different geopolitical risks that we are facing. Right? So, this is the brief gist. Now, the article also argues basically that the price of LPG has gone up, the LPG supply, particularly, for example, the 5 liter, the small bottled LPG cans that you have. Now, there the price rise has been huge, the supply has been very disruptive. Now, as a consequence of that, it has impacted the labor class and the poorer population to a large extent. Because the article argues that that particular category of cylinders is mostly utilized by the laborer section and also the migrant laborers. Now they are unable to get that, as a consequence of which they are basically, there is a kind of a reverse migration into the rural areas. However, we don't have any substantive data based evidence that it is indeed happening, the reverse migration we last India observed during the time of the COVID. We don't have an exact data based empirical evidence that it is indeed happening, but the circumstances indicate that that could be an eventuality. Okay, so here India's April retail inflation rose to a 13-month high of 3.48%. Later on, we will also take a look at the entire WPI curve here. Okay. Now, only slightly above March's 3.4%. So here, underlying inflationary pressures, wholesale price inflation increased from 3.8% in March to 8.3% in April. That means strong upstream price pressures. Now, the rise in WPI is mainly driven by fuel and power prices, which have risen by about 24%. However, globally, the petroleum and natural gas price has surged by more than 67%, which means energy inflation remains severe and not much of the inflation has been absorbed till now, or has been passed on till now. So that means more inflation is to follow. Logistics costs are going to increase. The price of food is going to increase. It has increased already. The CPI numbers have indicated a marginal increase in the food prices to almost around 4.2%. But still, with the increased logistic prices, the food prices will further skyrocket. And that can be very much disadvantageous to the vulnerable community. Now, the sharp divergence between CPI and WPI means what? That price pressure, WPI is high, but CPI is low, right? CPI is comparatively low, WPI, the inflation is very high. So, price rise is still absorbed absorbed by producers and wholesalers. Okay, so that means it will eventually be passed on to the consumers. So you and I, we have to brace for that price rise. Fall in the rupee leaves our current account deficit in the lurch as well. We have talked about the currency depreciation, limited headroom for the RBI, and that is where you will have the tightening and the increase in the interest rate, which will follow. Now, then you have another article talking about the case of the cooling doctrine. What is this case of the cooling doctrine? So, in April, for example, in one of the days, the 50 hottest cities across the world were in India. Year after year, as we come into the entire spectrum of climate change, we are experiencing that temperature rise. The duration of the heat waves is not only increasing, it is crippling. Now, it is causing casualties in many of the regions, losses, for example, of the working class. It is happening due to heat strokes. Now there are advisories which are issued almost every year, isn't it? Advisories which are issued, for example, that increase the water drinking facilities, the portals that you have, provide sheds in the bus stands, and so on. But all of this has limited outcome. It can only treat the people already at the fringes who are almost at the verge of sickness or death. We need to address the larger issue. Now, the article says that the 16th Finance Commission takes a departure. For the first time, 16th Finance Commission has asked for the heat waves to be declared as a kind of a national emergency, right? So heat waves as national disaster, right? Now, what will it do? It will increase the amount of funding, central funding, in order to tackle with the heat waves. But that will also have limited impact. The National Disaster Management Authority will be issuing orders like the water portals that we talked about. So that is why we need to come up with a kind of a cooling plan. How to ensure cooling? Now, India's summer is very different as compared to the summers, let's suppose, in Europe or US. Now, that is where majority of the cooling solutions that have been provided have simply been copy pasted from the European community and the American community. In those areas, the summers are dry. In our country, the summers are humid. What is the difference? If the summer is dry, even if, let's suppose, you perspire, you sweat, the sweat will evaporate, it will provide certain amount of cooling. However, if the summer is humid, what you observe, let's suppose in a Mumbai, in a Chennai, or in Kolkata, in those areas, in that case, you will not have the sweat evaporating. Yes, the wet bulb temperature will be high. When the sweat does not evaporate, you will continue to lose water, because evaporation of sweat provides natural cooling to your body. That will not happen. As a consequence, your body will suffer from dehydration and heat strokes. Right? So India's summer is different. So our solution to summers need to be different. We need to provide mandatory cooling in the workplaces. Mandatory cooling, right? Not just providing the kind of shade, but providing the kind of cooling, air conditioners, or whatever is required, reduction of temperature, then periodic and honest inspections in order to ensure this. Inspections. For example, take a case of Japan. Japan, even though a temperate country, in order to deal with the summer conditions, has come up with a kind of a unique jacket which has got micro fans or the mini fans installed within it to allow the circulation of air so that the temperature is low. So that is where we need to come up with the innovations to solve the working class. Because remember, construction is one of the larger job creators and the job avenues for the country. casual laborers, etc., they find employment in those areas. And you need to solve the issues for those workers. And that is where innovations need to be provided. Mandatory cooling needs to be provided in the warehouses, in the factories, in the commercial kitchens, and all of those. And that has to be tech driven. Okay. Because India's summers are different. Always remember that. Change in the work hours can also be sought to be done. Now, here, the article restricts itself to that, but let us also focus on two aspects. One is the case of India Cooling Action Plan, and the second is the case of passive cooling. We have to incorporate passive cooling. But first of all, what is India Cooling Action Plan? This becomes relevant for your prelims as well as the mains examination. Now, India Cooling Action Plan was launched in 2019 by Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change, and is a 20-year policy with a target of the 2037 and 38. The objective is to reduce cooling demand. How will you do that? By ensuring passive cooling. What is passive cooling? We'll take a look at it shortly. Right. Because mind you, more number of air conditioners that you install in a building, the air conditioners, the external unit of that, they generate heat, and that can further increase the amount of temperature that you observe outside. Reduce refrigerant demand, decrease HFC refrigerant demand by 25% to 30%, right? Reduce energy requirement and upskilling. This is the core objective of the cooling action plan. One of the main aspects of doing that is passive cooling. What is passive cooling? For example, let's suppose near your house you have, or wherever residential areas are there, you plant large number of trees. Now that will automatically reduce the temperature and moisture retention in that area. In the architecture also, the architectural designs that we are implementing, we need to follow the wind catchers. For example, now in many of the for example, Rajasthani architecture, the architecture in the Malwa region, you will come across this wind catcher design. What are these wind catchers? They have multiple perforations, right? This is also something that you will find in the Saracenic, the architecture in the region of the Arabian Peninsula. A lot of the older Saracens, they had this, Saracen buildings had this. Now, what is this wind catcher? It will have multiple perforations. Now, the wind which is moving at a greater height, that will be forced through one of the perforations. Okay, only one of the perforations would be allowed a downward inlet. Rest of the perforations will allow an upward inlet. So the cool air comes in and the warm air goes out. This manages to reduce the temperature inside a house, inside a room, by almost 3 to 4 degrees Celsius, provided under normal circumstances. In windy circumstances, even more. So these designs need to be incorporated. Then the breezeways that you observe, right? The warm air to be escaped from the upper level and the cold air to come in from the lower level. These are the ways in which you don't need an air conditioner, but you have a natural cooling of the space. This is what is passive cooling. You have the special, for example, the mud walls that you have, which are again coming into prominence. Now they act as a coolant during summer and as a insulator and a heat medium during winters. So those kind of innovative technologies need to be implemented. Now, space cooling in buildings. So that is again the part of the India Cooling Action Plan. So promotes passive cooling such as natural ventilation, reflective roofs, and green architecture. Cold chain and refrigeration, because we are a tropical country, so vaccination, medicines, etc., they do require the need of the cold chain and refrigeration to minimize spoilage even of vegetables and fruits. Transport, air conditioning, and R&D manufacturing, that needs to be solved. Okay, so that is the case of this India Cooling Action Plan. It is not mentioned in the article, but I feel it is relevant for you in this year's prelims as well as mains examination. So do take a look into it. Practice question: what are the measures which can be adopted by countries like India to tackle increasing occurrences of heat waves and higher temperature? Now, how do you introduce this answer? by the anecdote that I started the introduction with. That in April, on one of the days, 50 of the hottest cities of the world lied in India. A population which does work in extreme conditions will have a reduced output. Many of the people, they suffer, or the casualties run in hundreds every year due to the heat wave. So there is a need for solution. And then after that, you come into the body portion where you talk about the measures, India Cooling Action Plan, the aspect of the passive cooling, and move ahead into the conclusion where you talk about the utilization of human capital can be done, the productivity of the human capital can be maintained if you ensure adequate conditions. Okay. Now, one of the final article for the mains portion, capital flight and pressure on the rupee. Now, this article revolves around the same concept, and we will target only that concept. Okay, no need to go through the entirety of the article here. Basically, India's economy has been suffering a kind of a flight of capital. And that is something that we have been observing from the last year. If you observe the performance of the share market in our country, it has been in the negative. Right. Overall returns have almost been in the negative territory last year, 2025. 2026 is not doing much better. And why is that? Many of the FIIs, the foreign institutional investors, they are withdrawing money in large quantums away out of India. And they are withdrawing money in billions of dollars every particular year, every particular month. From 2025 onwards, we have been seeing a kind of an outflow. In certain cases, in certain months like November 2025, December, and so on, net outflow was much higher. So, as a consequence of that, there has been a run on the rupee. The value of the rupee has been reducing, depreciating. And we have discussed that what will be the impact if the value of the rupee depreciates, isn't it? So, see, if the rupee value depreciates, in simplest of the terms, let's try to understand it. If the value of the rupee depreciates, your imports become costlier. Now, what do you import? Imports become costly, right? Now, what do you import? Energy, right? So, energy becomes costly, gets costly. Now, that energy, tropical country like India, we have just talked about, our energy requirements are high. Other than that, majority of our goods are transported still by the fuel guzzling road sector. Majority of the goods, they are transported through the national highways and the road sector. So, your logistics cost of all of the things, logistics cost will increase. When the logistics cost will increase, what will happen? Inflation will increase. We have discussed just now that if inflation increases and the money supply is controlled, because please understand, inflation inherently is good, but provided it lies in a tolerable window. RBI's Monetary Policy Committee has also set up a tolerable window. I hope you are aware about that. What is the tolerable window of inflation as per the Monetary Policy Committee of RBI? Do let me know. Correct. So that is the tolerable window. Now, if that is exceeded, then your growth will take a hit. Growth reduces. If the growth of Indian economy, the growth reduces, more investors will withdraw the money out of India. Isn't it? Your current account deficit condition will worsen. When more people will withdraw the forex from India, rupee will further depreciate. And you are staring at a kind of a vicious cycle here also. So that is the case where the flight of capital has been happening. The rupee has weakened considerably against the major currency, isn't it? Now, here one has to understand that generally when does this happen? This generally happens when, let's suppose, when does when do you have greater amount of money outflow from countries like India? And why do people put money in India? Let's suppose an investor in Europe. Why will they put money from Europe into India? Because in India, The interest rates, they are high. They will get a considerable amount of return, isn't it? So the return of that, let's suppose you have invested some amount of dollars. So the return on that is supposed to be high. That is why you have invested here. Now imagine if US Fed increases the rates, increases rates. Now, which is more reliable economy to put money in if US has also increased rates? US. So all that money from here will move and will move to US now. So there is a flight of capital away from India. Let's suppose the central bank in Europe has also increased the rates. So whatever money is there, that will also move away, isn't it? So all of this will lead to what? Depreciation of the rupee. Rupee will start to depreciate, isn't it? That is why the prime minister, when he appealed that basically avoid foreign travel for 1 year, basically to prevent the run on the forex. The forex reserves have been depleting, right? So this rupee depreciation, mind you, is happening despite the fact that the interest rates by the developed economies have been not changed. They remain unchanged. Still, that depreciation is happening. Imagine if the interest rates here start to increase. Majority of the developing countries, they have their interest rates which are aligned with the interest rates of the developed countries, of US in particular, right? They, when US Fed increases the interest rate, you will have the developed countries also combating and impacting the interest rates, right? So that is where you basically still have not observed the developed markets to change the interest rate. Still there is a depreciation. And here, again, I will come back to the same argument that we made earlier. Much of that investment away from India is going into the region of China, is going into US. Why? Because these are the markets which are growing because of AI. These are the frontiers of AI. That is why the investors are putting money in these areas rather than relying on the Indian market. So that is something that we need to get our macro conditions to be sorted. We need to get the developmental priorities sorted. Otherwise, we are looking at a long term run of the currency. Okay, that is what the entire article is about. Now, coming to a couple of articles relevant for your prelims. So, Munnar to levy surcharge on tourist vehicles from Onam. Now, here, basically, while this is not much major of a story, so the Solid Waste Management Rules 2026 has brought about changes. Now, yesterday we have put out a video regarding all the environmental laws in one shot. Do take a look at that video. It is there we have covered the Solid Waste Management Rules 2016 and the changes in 2026 as well. So do take a look at it if we have not already. Now, Solid Waste Management Rules 2026 have brought about a lot of changes. One is the obvious case of targeting the case of the bulk generators of the waste, bulk generators, right? Like office buildings, the colleges, etc. Another is the case of the segregation of the waste into four categories, segregation of waste, then targeting of legacy waste, targeting of legacy waste like the landfills, etc. Legacy waste. But what is relevant for this particular aspect is now the regions of the hilly areas and islands. Now they have been empowered to charge a levy in order to manage the waste, in order to manage the case of the over tourism. Okay. And they can also limit the number of tourists. The number of tourists. Okay. coming into a region, into any particular area, in order to aspect, or in order to respect the sustainability aspect. Okay, so these are some of the changes. It is under these changes where now the hilly areas and the island regions can charge a levy. Okay, so observe that hundreds of tourists reach the hill station daily and leave a huge amount of waste behind. So it is dealing with the solid waste management rules 2026, relevant for your prelims examination. Now WPI more than doubles to 8.3% in April. Now, here, largely driven by the case of the fuel prices, WPI has increased. If you take a look at the weighing diagram of the WPI, manufactured products, substantial amount, fuel, power, and primary articles. So, fuel and power has been witnessing an increase. Now, this is from the government website where we have taken a look into this. Now, if you take a look at the WPI based inflation of all the commodities, observe the rapid rise here. Observe the rapid rise, almost turning out to be exponential since the outbreak of the Iran conflict. So that is why it is now entering into the dangerous territory, something that India witnessed around 2012, 2013. Right? Now, here, if you observe the inflation of fuel and power, right? So this fuel and power, the increase has been substantial in the past month, right? Overall, WPI inflation of the manufactured products is not that substantial, but it has been observing an inflationary trend since last year itself. So that is what the argument that I made in the earlier article also, that this is not something which is only the outcome of the Iran war. We have been observing the flight of the capital. We have been observing some of these trends since last year. That is why it is the time. For example, last year, pushed by the US tariffs, we did introduce as a country a slew of reforms: GST rationalization, labor force reforms, and so on. We need to further work upon that, accelerate that, and then be that forefront where the global capital is attracted. Okay, so that brings us to the end of the discussion for the day. I hope the discussion was meaningful and comprehensive. If you have liked this discussion, put that in the comment section below. And don't forget to click on the like, share, and the subscribe button. Till we meet again, take care of yourself. Goodbye. Thank you.